Nothing on the Bunnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bunnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical. Here's your host, Laura Bunnell.
Joan Galinkin is from New Jersey, but she had to move to Pittsburgh when her 33-year-old son Jesse had to have a lung transplant. Not only was it hard enough to hear that a transplant was needed as his lung function was at 20% and he was on oxygen, but he also had B. cepacia, and only certain transplant teams in the country will do that sort of transplant on persons with that deadly bacteria. And when I say deadly bacteria, I mean to the person who has CF. And that is changing a little bit as scientists work on medications that can fight that B. cepacia. So in 2019, Jesse was told he needed a transplant. His parents moved to Pittsburgh so he could get transplanted, and that was in April of 2020, the height of the pandemic with no vaccine in sight. So a very scary time, any time to be transplanted, and then on top of that, add a pandemic in the height of it. So we talked about a mother's fear, grief, and moving forward. Welcome, Joan. It's so good to see you, even though we're still over Zoom, but we are states away. But really, as CF moms, we are so close. But it is great to have you on this podcast. And it was wonderful to get to know you a little bit when you joined our CF Moms retreat. You know, it was really nice to talk to one another. So thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be in your company, in person or over Zoom. It's always a pleasure.
And I think I wanted to start with the first thing that struck me when we were talking on the Moms Retreat was that it is okay to talk about the sad part of CF and the grief of CF. We have so many ups and downs, right? And we're still making it through a pandemic. And when I was going over the notes before we started this, about your son had a transplant really at the height of the pandemic. April 2020, it hit the U.S. or certainly hit Michigan March 11th or 13th of 2020. How was that?
Well, it was, I'm trying to remember all the details. I remember he was like, we were so happy after 5 years. We were going to Pittsburgh for 5 years and he never needed oxygen. So no matter that his PFTs were in the 20s, finally he needed oxygen of December of 19. So we finally went back and they said, okay. And he was on prednisone. So we had to lower his prednisone. So we just waited and waited in Jersey. And then the end of April, they said we could come. And it was unbelievable. We found a place to rent.
And so you're in Jersey.
And we had to go to Pittsburgh.
About 5 hours, right?
It's really 5.5, 6, because Jesse has cepacia. So nobody else would do it besides Dr. Paluski in Pittsburgh, who, obviously in our family is pretty much an idol, an icon, as far as we're concerned. So we commuted to Pittsburgh. And at that time, my ex was working, his wife, and he had a 6-month-old daughter, 5-month-old daughter. So we had to leave his wife with a new baby. My ex was still working. We were all going to take turns staying in Pittsburgh. The only good part about COVID is my husband lost his job. So we were both in Pittsburgh together because there was so much medicine. And this is before the transplant, so much anxiety and medicine. And you're just waiting and waiting. And it was like Melrose Place. We rented an apartment and nobody wore a mask. Everybody was under 30 and nobody wore a mask.
Wow.
So we did not leave the apartment except to go food shopping. But everybody went through COVID. You took 10 hours to wash your food afterwards with alcohol or whatever. And then, ironically, my boyfriend's father died and he called me. And 10 minutes later, we got the call that Jesse had a lung. It was like the cycle of life. It was unbelievable. And he got the first time we didn't have to do it.
And not your father-in-law's lung, to be clear.
No. It's not my father-in-law. It's my boyfriend's father. He was 96. No, they did not.
Gotcha.
They did not take his lung. So, only one of us could go at a time. So my ex-husband went for the surgery, the night before, because Jesse gets so anxious, I wouldn't have been able to deal with it. And then I stayed for the next 3 weeks in the hospital with him, in ICU. And
just the fact of having to physically move and during a pandemic, and that there is family leave, but really our country is not equipped or doesn't prepare us for the ability to care for a child with a chronic illness. You don't have enough time off work. The only good thing there are several good things that have come from the pandemic, but people can work from home. You can work from a hospital. It depends on your job. But my gosh, going through this in one of the scariest times.
I know. But I mean, the ironic part was we were isolated. We were going to be isolated anyway, but the whole world was isolated. So it almost, not that it made it easier, but everybody, I worked online. I worked the whole time. I'm an accountant. I did taxes. My son, the whole time was working. He maybe didn't work for 3 weeks because he works from home.
Mm-hmm.
So that part and the fact that people wear masks anyway, I think made it easy for my son, because I think if there wasn't COVID and he was the only person wearing a mask, he wouldn't deal with it as well as I think now everybody feels a little more comfortable wearing a mask, which is just a little aside. But emotionally, I think, being autoimmune and all the things, this transplant has such different worries than CF.
Right.
Like the breathing, the machines, all that stuff, the vest, it's gone. Now you worry about autoimmune. And ironically, my son got COVID a month ago.
Oh my gosh.
But such little symptoms. He thought he had a cold from his daughter. I didn't know this, but when you're autoimmune, they said, since you have less antibodies, you get less symptoms when you get sick. I never knew that. But he's fine. He still tested positive 2 weeks later, but they said that could happen. But he had to move out of the house and live with my ex for 2 weeks. And then he finally got to go home.
I know there's also some issues with people who have had transplants because of their rejection medications.
Yeah.
The COVID vaccine doesn't always work, but it worked in his case.
Well, I'm assuming
it was just a breakthrough, right?
Right. We never tested antibodies, but maybe he wouldn't have had such a mild case because he already had the booster.
Mm-hmm.
And he did go and we did get the monoclonal antibodies, if that's the right word. We did go to the hospital and get that done once they found that he had COVID. I almost think now that he had it, not as anxious. I was so anxious of him getting it that something terrible was going to happen. Now I'm a little less anxious. Plus, I think everybody doesn't know how to live. Now they've Omicron. I mean, I feel like nobody knows what to do. If you have CF, if you have a transplant, if you're just like us.
Right.
It's as you know, it's just nothing to do with CF. It's just a really strange time to know what to do.
In reading all the information that you gave me about Jesse's journey, I read it and I thought, there is nothing in here. And I know you've voiced it before, like in the mom's retreat, but there wasn't anything in here about you, about your pain or how hard it must have been or how much PTSD you still have to have. And I think that's one of the things that I'm becoming more and more aware of, which is crazy because my daughters are 24 and 26. So I am aware of it, but I think we're always just getting through to the next exacerbation, right? We're living life. We're positive. I think of my girls are going to live a long life, but you're still, or I feel like I'm still always holding my breath. Okay. Got to get through the pandemic. And then what's going to happen and this and this and this. So what are your feelings now that you are looking back on, the transplant and we're still in a pandemic? As a mom, how did you get through it and are getting through it?
Well, I think that I'll try not to cry. Taking care of my son, making sure he's okay, has always been the first thing on my mind every day. I just probably somewhat to his detriment. I was pretty much an enabler. If I look back, I should have, not been such, but I just felt like whatever I could do to make his life easier, anything. When he was little, I would go to every McDonald's to get every toy, whatever could make him happy. But I feel like my son, once he went to college, his PFTs were so low that my perspective changed. Like I knew he was going to need a transplant. When he was a teenager, I thought it was somewhere in the road. So I feel like my expectations of his life might have been, if lower is the right word, than other people. I was just wanting him to be healthy. I wasn't worried about him getting married. I wasn't worried about what kind of job he had. I didn't think about the global things that I think most parents think about. Now that he's had the transplant and he's married and he has a child, sometimes I don't know where to put myself in the caretaker role anymore. You know what I mean? Like, I think his wife is very much, has the baby to worry about, and it's always, and her mother helps her. And I still to this day, am pretty involved in my son's life. You realize you don't really know, but it's not the same. And where do you fit as your child gets to be in their 20s?
Right. I agree. It's really interesting because the one time when my daughter was at college it was her graduation actually from Michigan State University. And she had an exacerbation. She had hemoptysis, and her boyfriend at the time was like, I'm staying at the hospital with her. And he was sleeping in her hospital bed with her. And it was a whole new feeling. I was like, well, I'm staying. So all three of us are staying.
Get out.
So, and it was fine. But yeah, it's a learning curve, right?
Yes. And I think some children, or if children's the right word, with CF are more independent than mine, because I think I said, because I am an enabler, he's used to relying on me. There's a lot of things he doesn't, and he's a father now, and he's totally responsible. But I do feel that people are different. You know what I mean? Some kids are very independent. Some kids like to have the aid. Some kids, they get married or they have kids, and that changes the dynamics. And I think I personally don't understand the impact of the new drugs because they mean nothing to me. My son had a transplant already, and he's got the nonsense mutation, so they don't have anything for him anyway. So I'm sure that's changed the dynamic in a way that I can't relate to.
Right.
As far as people worrying a little less.
Right. Because of the new drug that, changes the underlying condition of CF. But then you look at my girls, it worked for one, it didn't work for the other. So
I know
that last 10% that Emily's entourage is actually working very hard and,
right.
to get is very meaningful. But as we go, and we're talking back to parenting an adult, you almost need training, right, on what to do, because it's about it's about finding your place. But it is a family disease. It's not like Jesse or Molly and Emily, like they did it on their own.
Yes.
And now, thank goodness, now they're married, no worries. Or now they have a significant other. You're still big time a part of it in just different ways. I think you nailed that.
Yeah, no, I think it really depends on the parent-child relationship. It depends on the child's health. Some young adults are doing really well, and it becomes easier for the parents to step back a little bit and feel the positiveness of whatever. A transplant, there's one other woman I've talked to whose child has a transplant. Jesse's like, he works. He's married. Some people with transplants, he said, they don't work, or some people are really sick, don't really work full time. Mm-hmm. And, some people have a totally different lifestyle where they're probably still live at home or are more dependent on their family, depending on how sick they are. You can tell somebody that your child has CF, but there are so many different levels and so many different stories that go with it. But it is very nice, like you said, to talk to other mothers of people with CF. When he was young, I really think I chose to not ignore it at all, but try to make his life as almost too normal.
Right.
I didn't really make CF as, big a part and push him to take care of himself. You want to sleep over your friend's house? But, I just wanted him to be normal in the worst way,
right?
And not feel different in any way. And sometimes you really, they are different. And if their friends know and your family know, it should be just part of who they are and not any stigma attached. And maybe my son felt a little bit like he didn't want people to know when he was younger.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because although where my kids went to school, that community knew, the girls were fine with everyone knowing, but I also kind of did similar. I almost went to the other end. No excuses. Everybody has something. We have CF.
Right.
You can't stay home from school. There's just no excuses.
Right.
And at some point, you have to say, you know what? You do have CF. And, my girls were taking PICC lines and their IV poles to school and flushing their own meds. And we really...
To school?
Yes. Yeah. We might have been a little crazy on the other side, just making it normal, just going to school and everybody asks how we're doing. Oh, everything's fine. We're doing fine. So we might have gone a little too extreme, and maybe you needed more to say, you know what? It's really hard. They're up constantly because of the IV meds. You got to wake up every, 6 hours or in the middle of the night, because you have to do it so many times a day, et cetera.
Yes.
But, we did what we did, and no one's a perfect parent, right?
No. I'm sure, do your children talk about what you did for them and how they felt about you as a parent with CF? You shouldn't have done that, or you should have done that. Do you have those conversations?
We do sometimes, or they'll laugh if I'm trying to do too much. I've got this now, Mom. I can call the insurance company. I can make they're definitely into that, doing the insurance, and of course making all their doctor's appointments now, and they won't even let me go. And I'm like, oh, really? I'd really like to come to that CF appointment, but they're like, no.
We have to go to Pittsburgh because he has bronch and somebody has to take him and not take him. But I don't talk as much in the meetings, in the doctor's appointments.
Right.
I just sit and listen. The insurance thing, I still try to help out somewhat, because sometimes I feel like that's just, such a pain in the neck.
Right.
You know
exactly.
what I mean? This and that and whatever. And I feel like he has a lot between having a job and having a baby and taking care of himself. It's not like he's not a responsible citizen. If he was just sitting around doing nothing, I'd say, well, you do it. But, I feel like I still want to make his life a little easier if I can.
And I do think they need our help and our experience. And of course, they're adults and doing things. But I always try and think, if I was, I'm meeting with a CF mom locally here in a couple hours, and she's a new CF mom. And I think, what will her questions be, or what can I tell her? There's no mistake-free parenting.
Right.
It's just not possible. Even if you're a parent to a dog or a cat, you're always going to make a mistake. You leave them too long, or you don't take the dog outside, whatever. So I know we can't be perfect, but I do think, what is my best advice? What would your best advice be?
I guess I tell the parent, you just have to listen to what the doctor said. Try to make their life as normal as possible, but make them realize they're responsible for taking care of themselves. But I just feel it must be so much more positive now, that the doctors, the CF doctor, must feel so much more able to tell the parent all these good things.
I think there's more hope, right?
So much more
Yeah,
hope.
that's what I would think.
So much more hope. And the only thing I feel sometimes, you can't go back in time, like you said. If you have cancer, if you have a child that has cancer, they have cancer. There's X amount of medicines. The thing about CF that can make you get so mad at yourself is there's things you can do to make it better. Like, did you exercise enough? Did I make him take his medicine enough? We got a hot tub for a while. I shouldn't have. I feel like there's so many things with CF that you can feel like you made mistakes with. Whereas I feel like other disease, you have the disease, you take the medicine, God willing, you get better. But with CF, my son and I sometimes say, yeah, we realize we should have been stricter when he was younger. Maybe that would have made a difference. Or maybe we should have gone on. Sometimes he didn't want to go on IV. We should have gone on IV. So I feel like that's the only thing about CF. And maybe there were other diseases like that. You can have self-doubt that you didn't always do the right thing. Did you feel that way?
I understand, but there are so many variables. And then I think I also know families who followed everything to the letter. And then it's just the biology of it that it just didn't matter. And I think for us, what I felt we needed to do, and my husband, and what we decided to do, was there had to be a balance.
Right.
There had to be an emotional and physical balance. Like, okay, you're not doing your treatment because you have got to go to this volleyball game that you're, in whatever.
Right.
Okay, so then you're doing it after the game, your treatments or whatever. So there was that. And then I also I would always try and think about other, quote, normal families who maybe they didn't take, all the medications they were prescribed. Like, no one is perfect. Like, who's judging me or my kids?
Right.
I mean, to be adherent 24/7, 365 days a year, it's truly impossible.
No, that absolutely.
You can only do your best. So I think it's kind of finding that balance and being honest, right? But yes, it gives us a lot of guilt.
Well, yes, because I guess I thought maybe I didn't do enough reading when he was young, is that whatever case you had, you had. If you had a mild case, you had a mild case. If you didn't have a mild case, you didn't have a mild case. I didn't really, because I know that my first doctor stressed it, I didn't really understand at the beginning how much what you did would make a difference. But you're right. I have heard people say kids do nothing and they're healthy as can be. And kids do everything and they get sick. So I think it's probably like that nature nurture thing in life itself. Some of it's just genetic and some of it's how you deal with it that makes a difference. I mean, Jesse has 2 nonsense genes, which is awful. Some people have 1 nonsense and 1 whatever. So,
right.
He's as a stopgap, you get nothing. There's nothing positive that happens when you have nonsense.
Well, and there's so many mutations, which is what you're talking about. So thousands now.
I know.
It was, I think, 760. That number sticks in my head when my daughters were born. And that wasn't that long ago. And now there's thousands. I mean, they were always the same amount of mutations. It's just that it took them, the Genome Project, to discover.
But they still only have 3 ways that the CTRF or whatever travel. You know what I mean? So the stopgap is the worst because you get nothing through there and the other ones are a little bit better. So I guess it depends what your mutation falls under those 3.
Right.
But he was 7 months when we found that he had CF. And then the next year they found the gene. And the doctor said, by the time he's a teenager, they'll have a cure.
Because they discovered the gene in 89, right?
So he was born in 88. So they didn't have the gene. And then they discovered the gene in 89. And it was like, by the time he's a teenager, they'll have a cure. Because I can't believe, what did they call the thing when they replace the cells? I can't believe I can't think of the word.
Are you talking gene editing or gene therapy?
Gene therapy. They said, they'll have gene therapy by the time he's a teenager. And it'll be great. And if they did, he would be fine. But it's much harder to find them. I guess gene therapy didn't work the way they thought it was.
Right. Well, and I remember Dr. Francis Collins saying, who was part of the Genome Project, a huge part, saying, we thought things would go a lot faster.
I know.
And they were surprised by that. But it's so interesting, the mom journey of where it takes us.
Yes.
And then they're adults and they do need us, but it's a different kind of direction for us, I think.
I mean, they're adults, you know what I mean? And I think it's hard for parents to let go. I don't think it's as hard for the kids as it is hard for the parents when you're a caregiver to all of a sudden be less of a caregiver and to realize, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you tell the doc?
Right.
We don't talk about it every day. I don't call them and tell them what to do.
Right. And I know Jesse had a transplant, but I remember at some point, I don't know if the girls were 8 and 10, but I remember saying to their CF doctor, I just need to know, how old are they going to be? Like, what are they going to live to? And it's not like she could tell me,
right? But
I needed her to. I needed this wondering and thinking like, okay, they're going to die between 17 and 19. Thankfully, they have not. They've surpassed that, but that was their life expectancy at the time. And eventually she said, oh, well, they'll probably make it till 60. And at that time, I was like, oh, well, that would be a relief, but I always worried. And now Emily recently had a CF visit, and her doctor said, because of all these new drugs, these CF modulator drugs, she said, you're not going to die from CF.
That's amazing.
And Emily's like, wow, we still have to get a drug that works for Emily because the drug only works for Molly, the triple combo drug. And there's still challenges. It's not like, oh, just because everyone says there's a drug, no one's going to have any problems. I think that's the hard thing too for new parents is there is this promising drug out there and more to come, but it still doesn't make everything all better. People I know that are on this, triple combination drug, yes, it's had a huge impact on their life,
right,
but they're still having exacerbations, so it isn't perfect.
Yeah, I think like there's certain people that feel like I've heard somebody say the son, you can plan for the future now, whereas people would maybe they wouldn't get married, maybe they wouldn't have kids because they weren't sure. And I think now people probably feel more positive about that. I mean, having a kid is still a lot of work when you have CF, but at least you'll be around, which is really a big difference, I think.
Absolutely. So now what do you see for your future? Do you feel like, all right, now you can do a little more, with your own life or travel more, or obviously we're in the pandemic still, but what are your thoughts for you for the future?
Oh, I mean, the kids used to live with me and now they don't. And I feel like I have my own life and Jesse has his own life, and I'm still there for him. But, it's nice, because, it's been a big part of my life. It's still a part of my life, but I feel like, okay, now I have like a little more of my own space in my own life. I mean, the pandemic definitely makes an influence. I was never a big traveler, but I have friends all over the country and I'm not rushing to go, I miss them, but I'm not rushing to go see them. And they live in warm climates. So that, the travel and the COVID is really, it made things a little more difficult, but it's nice. I love having a granddaughter. I love that he has a daughter. And I mean, with transplant, they sort of say, if you make it past 5 years, that's really a good sign for you being able to make it longer. I worry about the future and I worry about what if something happens to me and, he won't have me as a backstop or whatever, but you can't put yourself in that place. You can just plan as much as you can to make whatever arrangements need to be made to make his life easier if something ever happened to me. So I do feel like it would be a little harder for him if I wasn't around. It's nice to have,
of course,
that person in your corner that is always there for you and will help you out, stuff like that. But I also feel like, people survive and learn how to, like I think I'm so important, but maybe it'd be fine without me.
Well, you are, and all his history.
Yes.
And that's the thing. We know things that we probably haven't even shared with our kids just because we just did it. We knew it intuitively. Right. You just knew. We could tell things
Well, I think it's having your mother or your father, wherever the relationship works out, the parents, they're always there to help you. I think that's a very reassuring feeling.
I do too. And I think that's probably a very common mom thought. Like right. I've thought, well, I absolutely need to live forever. Right. Or I absolutely need to live as long as my girls do because they need me.
Yes.
I mean, yes.
Right.
So, that's really hard. I'm sure there's some diagnosis for whatever that is.
No, I think like, what about people who have kids that are, emotionally and physically disabled and you're so, like my kid can survive without me, but I still feel like I want to, be there. So I should probably drink less and eat better, but I, to live longer, but I don't. But, it is always in the back of your head that you're very happy right. to be able to help them. And, you worry what's going to happen if you're not around, but other people obviously pick up the slack and they, they're adults.
Right. They'll be fine. They have friends and spouses and
yes.
in-laws other parents that are friends.
Right. But they're not us.
Right. Oh, they're not
us.
There's no comparison. Absolutely. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to add or talk about?
I guess if there's anybody that whose child has had a transplant is listening, who gets to listen, I do think there's a little sadness that these drugs didn't come in time to help my son. That's something that, every once in a while, but there are parents who have lost children, who could feel even stronger than I do about that. Like that's the only, as joyful as I am for everybody who has been helped by this drug, I can't tell you that I'm not a little sad that my son wasn't able to be helped in time. So that's the only thing I guess I'd want to share with other parents who are in the same situation I am.
And I think that's huge. And I do think that's a loss. Not comparing it to Jesse's situation because he had a transplant and my girls have not had to go through that. But I feel the loss for Emily.
Yes,
because it didn't work for her. And I'm so happy for Molly. And Emily, I remember when she failed on it, and saying she failed on it is probably a terrible word to use, but it didn't work for her. And I remember her saying to Molly, you better get on this just because it didn't work for me. You have to do it. And, so there was that sisterly support, but it is definitely a loss and something that we grieve over. And it's just all part of this big, huge disease.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. That's a huge point.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was very nice. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to share.
You too. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, a mom who has a child who has a transplant, they can email the Bonnell Foundation and we'll get them in touch with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us.
All right, sweetie. Thank you. See you soon.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, check them out online at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, the science of possibility, and produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts.